Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 5 of Series 7. The question for this evening is, does postmodernism resolve or ignore questions about value? The reading from one of my works is The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 1, Section 9. In these workshops, I often talk about the issue of value being neglected, and today I'm going to talk about that neglect in the context of postmodernism. This is so because I take value to be crucial to resolving questions of human existence. That is, value is crucial to the activities of ethics, aesthetics, meaning and purpose, and the alternatives like cognitive, affect and volitional states cannot resolve these issues. In response, I propose a principle of value expressed in value states such as magnanimity, love and self-esteem. The principle itself is the pursuit of value, the will to value leading to a sufficiency of value. So these workshops attempt to explain different aspects of that view. Last week we discussed how the concept of value has been overlooked and neglected in general. This week we'll look at postmodernism and how modernism seems to have neglected value. Yet I want to show that postmodernism just doesn't neglect value, but that a neglect or a disregard of value is central to postmodern thought, and that postmodernism is best explained with the concept of value that postmodernism doesn't acknowledge. We can begin to show these things with a definition of postmodernism. Jean-Francois Lyotard coined the word postmodernism in 1979 and defined it as an incredulity towards meta-narratives. Meta-narratives are overarching explanations like Marxism, religion and even science. So in this way, postmodernism has even thought to be an anti-value. But postmodernism might be better described as anti-values rather than anti-value. This is because postmodernism challenges particular values like those of religion or metaphysics, but it paradoxically presupposes a strong theory of seemingly unrecognized value in order to do this. That is, a key feature of postmodernism is the idea of the rejection of privilege, and usefully the rejection of privilege can be seen as a rejection of bias and pursuit of neutrality. But I want to show that the rejection of privilege is also a rejection of preference, and preference together with subjectivity and quality is one of the key ways of defining value. So postmodernism is also a rejection of value and seems to be throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And as a rejection of privilege, postmodernism is a philosophy of radical criticism rather than an ideology. This definition is endorsed by its main characteristics, which we can name as the following. 1. An extreme skepticism of the concept of truth and universal reason. 2. Revisionism and skepticism of all philosophy and a deconstruction of the meaning of text. And 3. A rejection of meta-narratives, privilege and foundationalism. Postmodernism thereby seeks to destabilize traditional concepts. These are such as presence, identity, historical progress, epistemic certainty and the univocity of meaning. And to do this, postmodernism employs concepts such as difference, repetition, trace, simulacrum, and hyperreality, which we have yet to explain. Yet postmodernism can also be identified by several substantive characteristics. These are human autonomy, subjectivism, individualism, relativism, skepticism, and even nihilism. Yet these may be thought as positive or negative depending upon one's point of view. Another way of defining postmodernism can be by contrast to other schools of philosophy. For example, postmodernism can be thought to have breadth, whereas phenomenology has depth, and analytic philosophy has precision. That is, an analytic philosophy is concerned with precision of meaning and knowledge in language and logic. Phenomenology focuses on description and understanding consciousness. But the breadth of postmodernism has something to say about every human activity. And as an expose and critique of the problems of value in every human activity, I have some agreement with postmodernism. But I disagree with its relativism and nihilism, which I hold can be resolved through subjectivity. That is, the subjectivity of human consciousness, which constrains as well as creates values. Today we can look at 5 of the areas that postmodernism has something to say about. These are 1. Meaning and human purpose, 2. Language or epistemic meaning, 3. Ethics, 4. Science, and 5. Mind. With respect to mind or consciousness, postmodernists like Richard Rorty have physicalist inclinations. Yet in rejecting the idea of consciousness, they automatically reject any structures of consciousness. And opposing phenomenology further, postmodernists are post-structuralists or anti-structuralists. That is, they reject the structures posited by phenomenologists, existentialists, and others. Jacques Derrida, for example, attacks the view that a finite structure can underlie the whole network of a culture. That is, postmodernism typically rejects the linguistic, social, and psychological structures of such as Saussure, Marx, and Freud. But structures of consciousness are not social or psychological structures, but we can say that they are conditions of existence. Yet postmodernists also reject such foundations in principle as an unjustifiable preference or privilege. Yet paradoxically, postmodernists do make claims about mind that they can use as destabilizing tools. But from another point of view, such can be regarded as endorsing the idea of structure. Gilles Deleuze, for example, describes individuality as differential, forever dividing itself and changing. Deleuze postulates multiple faculties giving rise to feeling, thought, and action. And he writes that schizophrenia is not only a human fact, but also a possibility for thought. That is, such psychological conditions have been seen to give rise to creative thought in literature and art. Yet such divisions can also be described as divisibility, that is, as a structure of consciousness. Postmodern critiques of the values of underlying meaning and purpose are initially easy to agree with. Postmodernists reject fixed human purposes, manifest destiny, and things that are meant to be. These might be fallaciously thought set by God, nature, society, or other authorities. Yet existentialists agree that values are created by choices and purposes cannot be externally imposed. Some agreement can also be found here with Mackie's rejection of objective values. And other arguments support a postmodern critique of fixed purposes of natural events. For example, in his criteria of definition, Aristotle included the value state of purpose, or what something is for. But today we don't believe in such purposes. We define things with overt characteristics like size or mass. But we do use purpose to define things like a hammer, but we acknowledge that we, in such cases, attribute purpose. But for Aristotle, purpose is inherent to an object. For example, the purpose of a stone is to bury itself deeper into the ground. Modern and postmodern views agree in rejecting this application of purpose. This critique of purpose is also applicable to an argument for the existence of God. The argument from contingency was famously discussed between Father Copleston, SG, and Bertrand Russell. Copleston held that finite human beings must find the reason and purpose for their existence in a self-sufficient God. He reasons that no object or experience contains within itself the reason for its existence. And in brief, this reason must be external and sufficient in itself, which must be God. Bertrand Russell described this argument as a nest of confusions. One of them, in my view, is a conflation of two meanings of reason as purpose and cause. That is, objects or anything else have causes, but not reasons or purposes for their existence. People can find purpose within themselves, but objects or the totality of objects don't have purposes. Postmodern value theory can also be seen as a radical extension of Hume's principle of an is-ought distinction. Hume's principle is that we can't derive a prescriptive moral ought from a factual is. But postmodernism takes this idea and runs with it to eschew all preferential values. I myself support the view that purposes can only be legitimately attributed by conscious beings. But against postmodernism, I hold that structures of consciousness can furnish values, meaning and purpose. Postmodernism also makes a radical critique or deconstruction of the meaning of language. Jacques Derrida criticized the history of philosophy as logocentric, implying absolute meaning. He held that meaning of the text is undecidable and that language is subjective. Derrida famously claimed that there is no outside text. That is to say, its meaning is open, not fixed, and no outside authority can impose meaning on it. Such may be an editor or a church telling us what a book or piece of scripture must mean. So postmodernists hold that there is no fixed intrinsic meaning to text which is attributed by the reader, and they will not even privilege or value the meaning attributed by the author over the reader. For example, Paul Ricoeur describes an author as the first reader. So on this view, scripture, constitutions and statute laws are open to different and equally valid interpretations. On a postmodernist view, we can then say that the meaning of the text is open to personal, if not valued, judgment. That is, the text is not only open to interpretation, but to radical interpretation almost without limit. That is, the meaning of the text is subject to the knowledge, judgment and goodwill of the reader. This seems to be implausible, especially with factual or scientific texts. Another interpretation of this view is as a refusal to locate value references in the external world. And this again shows an unacknowledged relation between postmodernism and value. Derrida's argument for the relativity of language is that meaning is both historical and structural. He describes historical meaning obscurely as diachronic and structural or immediate meaning as synchronic. This means that meanings really refer to all other references which are absent. But this cannot be done, so the full meaning of anything can't be fully articulated. But I'm sceptical whether the postmodern theory of meaning takes us very far. Standard critiques of language and Wittgenstein's complex theory also reject complete meaning. Yet the postmodern theory of meaning opens the door to further subjectivity and relativity. Nietzsche can also be criticized for having such unbounded interpretations. Of course, Nietzsche predated postmodernism, but he had some postmodern views. He wrote, "There are no facts, only interpretations, and that facts do not exist, only interpretations." But in criticism of this postmodernist view of meaning, we can claim that there are limits to interpretation. That is, all interpretation takes place in context with reference to boundaries of meaning. They are bounded by intelligibility, circumstance, and the concepts at our disposal. For example, a medieval monk could not think about computers or quantum theory. A couple of other examples can be given to show the limits or boundaries to thought and interpretation. One is that Kant held that we cannot think outside the categories of space and time, and another is that number and logic are the most general and abstract categories that circumscribe our knowledge. The problem for postmodernism is that interpretation takes place in context with set boundaries of meaning and understanding, and those boundaries draw limits on what we can choose to think about or value. But postmodernism implies a seemingly implausible absence of guiding values and limits. Beyond language, postmodernism has also had a lot to say about the meaning of reality. In the current postmodern age, image and illusion blur the distinction between the real and the unreal. Nietzsche speaks of a vaporizing reality and a disillusion of the distinction between the real and the apparent world. In Jean Baudrillard's hyperreality, entertainment, simulation and the virtual world replace reality. Hyperreality is the terminal stage of simulation where a sign has no relation to any reality whatsoever, and commonalities are bought and displayed as much as for their sign value as their functional use value. The issue of a vaporizing or hyperreality raises the question, what is real? Bishop Butler posed the question 3 centuries ago, arguing that the physical world was really the mind of God. Samuel Johnson attempted to refute such idealism by kicking a stone and saying, "I refute it thus." Rutherford posed a similar problem by revealing the world as a mass of atoms in a void. The point is that what is the real world doesn't depend on theological, postmodern or scientific discoveries. It depends upon our daily experiences and what we choose and value to be real. Yet, of course, theological, postmodern and scientific ideas can have some bearing on those values. The postmodern view of science appears to be the most untenable. This seems due to what remains in the resilience of the fact-value distinction, which has now become blurred around the edges. That is, pragmatic and working facts about the world are less subject to interpretation. Paul Feyerabend expressed his concern in the title of his work, How to Defend Society Against Science. At his most extreme, Feyerabend described science as epistemological anarchy and that anything goes. And he held that the acquisition of scientific knowledge isn't governed by universal rules or method. But against this view, the limits of scientific knowledge already has a long and more moderate history. That is, the self-critical nature of science, as well as the method of doubt in Descartes, Leibniz, Hume and others. But in Feyerabend's favour, science doesn't proceed in the logical way that it was once thought to. This view is supported by Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. That is, science isn't a gradual accumulation of knowledge, but revolutions that overwhelm and overturn theories. In further defence of Feyerabend, he claims to criticise the supposedly unique status of scientific fact. He writes, "My criticism of modern science is that it inhibits freedom of thought." But that seems to depend on whether we see science as all-embracing or just as one aspect of knowledge. And postmodern critiques of science don't seem to appreciate the limits of interpretive value. Postmodern approaches to ethics are more corrosive and more problematic, as well as for postmodernism itself. This is because ethics is quintessentially subject to value, and ethical values lack secure foundations. The problem is that postmodernism rejects both normative values and objective moral principles. Zygmunt Bauman speaks of a rejection of the search for absolutes, universals and foundations, and Adam Phillips states that universal moral principles must be eradicated. These are to be replaced with local and situational responses of individual uniqueness. This is comparable to Christian situation ethics, but without the guiding principle of informed Christian love. And the idea of situational uniqueness is paradoxically found in the covert postmodernism of Jordan Peterson. But the problem for postmodernism is that without ethical values or principles, we can't construct an ethic. One of my criticisms of postmodernism is their refusal to refer to any normative values at all, and their rejection of religion and social or other structures denies them access to value. Postmodernist ethics is more problematic than existentialism, which holds the values of freedom and authenticity. One postmodernist response is an anarchic neglect of ethics. Another response is to look to applied social and bioethics. but social and biological grounds are infamously inadequate to the needs of ethics. And we need to explain the moral intuition that the moral good is really good and not just socially acceptable. Without some kind of objective, universal or normative values, we are subject to ethical relativity. The idea of ethical relativity is illustrated in Sartre's character Jean Genet. In Genet, Sartre proposed the idea of an ethical inversion of good be my evil, evil be my good. Yet postmodernism isn't totally without ethical responses. In 2005, Kostika Dumbrava offers two postmodern ethics as communitarian ethics and the ethics of care. A postmodern response to their problems of ethics is thereby to deploy the notion of care. The notion of care was also used in Heidegger's existentialism and in feminist approaches to virtue theory. And the idea of care ostensibly points to it being a value state. The postmodernist Michel Foucault advises further inquiry into both subjectivity and the notion of care. He encourages the agent to ask, how have I constructed myself as a moral agent? And in asking about the care of the self, he focuses on three major forces of power, truth and subjectivity. Foucault sees the care of the self resulting from analysis of and negotiation between these competing influences. But this analysis has become political and social rather than focusing on the concept and the subjectivity of value. So it appears that in respect to ethical value, that postmodernism seems to be most lacking. Moreover, questioning oneself as a moral agent is a good start, but again may be appreciating the scope of value. Foucault expands the issue into political and the social, but ethics has an unjustified monopoly over value. A more comprehensive care of the self needs to include aesthetics, meaning and purpose. These are some of the aspects of a wider conception of the self as a valuational being. Jürgen Habermas of the Frankfurt School criticizes postmodernism as reflexive, or as he calls it, the paradox of self-referentiality. That is, it employs analytic and linguistic critiques that only modern reason can provide, and that it assumes social or psychological structures in its criticisms that it ostensibly rejects. He accuses Foucault of not using his analysis of power against the status of his own writings, and that postmodernism uses social and psychological theories on a pragmatic ad hoc basis. Habermas makes a further criticism of postmodernism, that their experiential and obfuscated language is less communicative than traditional thought. Habermas accuses Derrida of trying to turn reason into a kind of rhetoric. This may or may not be the case, but Derrida admitted to using convoluted language to avoid being thought of as simplistic. Yet my response to Habermas is that his criticism is inadequate. That is, he criticizes postmodern methods rather than confronting its underlying philosophical positions. That is, that might be expected of an analytic philosopher. Habermas doesn't defend the concept of consciousness against the postmodernist attack, or in my view criticise the postmodernist neglect or even negation of value. In conclusion, I can say that I am sympathetic to postmodern critiques but argue against their conclusions. That is, postmodernism poses problems of value and justification, yet without making the issue of value explicit. Yet postmodernism doesn't just neglect value, but is anti-value and is against the possibility of establishing values. But to do that, its anti-value stance in fact covertly employs a strong position on value. And this adds to Habermas's critique that postmodernism is contradictory. This is the most severe criticism that could be levelled against any philosophy. Yet on a positive note, I support the postmodern critique of meaning and ethics as a critique of objective value. For example, it opposes a particular values of privilege, justification, universality and objectivity. But its inherent physicalism precludes structures of consciousness and its principles of value. Postmodernism also had some interesting things to say about the relativity of language and meaning, but it went too far in dismissing the anthropocentric perspective which constrains meaning. That is, facts must be understood in contexts that are bounded by human life. The excesses of postmodernism become more obvious in its attitude to science. The possible harm of technology has been a concern to Heidegger, ecologists and others. But Furban goes further to say that a truth that reigns without checks and balances is a tyrant who must be overthrown. Yet this itself appears to be a rather unbalanced view. Yet there is some truth in the postmodern case of the influences and dangers of science. Analytic philosophy has imitated physical science and has failed in understanding the human condition. As stated earlier, postmodern approaches to ethics are both more erosive and more problematic also for itself. This is because ethics is quintessentially subject to value, and ethical values lack secure foundations. And it's by no means clear that postmodern ethics of communitarianism or care can resolve this problem. Finally, as a negative criticism of philosophy, postmodernism rejects values and precludes evaluative solutions. That is, ethics, aesthetics, meaning and purpose are value activities resolved in terms of value. And I have myself proposed a principle of human life in terms of value and value states. That is, I have a preference for value states like self-esteem and moral fortitude over cognitive states and affect states, and a preference for the will to value and the value of value leading to a certain sufficiency of value. But postmodernism rejects such privileging or preference and thereby lacks principles of value. So let me have your criticisms and comments at the meeting or on the meetup or YouTube internet pages.